The gunshot that killed Jackson Miller's wife and daughter didn't make a sound in his memory, just an endless silence that followed him for 3 years across every dusty trail and lawless town in the New Mexico territory. He rode into Aztec in the spring of 1883 with nothing but a horse that had seen better days, a Colt revolver he barely remembered to clean, and a heart that had stopped feeling anything the day he buried them both under a cottonwood tree outside Santa Fe. The town sat along the Animas River, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but large enough to disappear into if a man wanted to be left alone. Jackson wanted exactly that. He found work at the lumber mill on the edge of town, a job that required his hands and back, but nothing from the hollow space in his chest where something vital used to live. The other men tried to make conversation at first, but his silence wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind that made people uneasy, made them stop asking questions, made them eventually stop seeing him at all. He lived in a room above the general store that smelled like leather and tobacco. Every morning he woke before dawn, pulled on the same worn clothes and walked to the mill. Every evening he returned, ate whatever didn't require thought to prepare, and sat by the window watching the sun set over the mesas in the distance. The colors should have been beautiful. He knew they were beautiful. He remembered a time when he would have called them that. Now they were just light and shadow, nothing more. The numbness was better than the alternative. In the beginning, after it happened, the pain had been so consuming he couldn't breathe through it. Every memory was a knife. Every moment alone was an eternity of loss. So when the numbness came, creeping in like morning frost, he welcomed it. He stopped fighting. He stopped feeling. He existed, and that was enough. Then on a Tuesday in late May, Penelope Sanders walked into the general store below his room, and everything he'd carefully constructed began to crack. He didn't see her that first day. He only heard her voice through the floorboards, clear and warm like honey in tea, asking the shopkeeper about fabric for curtains. There was something in her tone, a brightness that seemed impossible in a place as harsh as the New Mexico territory, that made him pause in the motion of pulling off his boots. He sat there, one boot in hand, listening to her laugh at something the shopkeeper said. The sound was so foreign to him that for a moment he couldn't place what it was. The next time he saw her was Sunday at the town's small church, a whitewashed building that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind. Jackson only went because his landlady, Mrs. Chen, had asked him to help repair some of the pews, and he couldn't think of a good reason to refuse. He was on his knees with a hammer when Penelope walked in with her father, a weathered man who moved with the stiffness of someone whose body had given its best years to hard labor. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her dark blonde hair was pinned up in a way that looked both practical and pretty. But it wasn't her appearance that struck him. It was the way she moved through the world, like someone who still believed in it. She smiled at Mrs. Chen. She helped an elderly woman find her seat. She touched her father's arm with such gentle affection that Jackson had to look away, something painful twisting in that numb place inside him. He finished the repair work quickly and left before the service started, but the image of her stayed with him. That night, lying in his narrow bed, he found himself thinking about the way sunlight had caught in her hair, and he was disturbed to realize he'd noticed. He hadn't noticed anything in 3 years. Their first real conversation happened by accident. Jackson had been at the river, washing his face in the cold water, trying to wake up enough to face another identical day. Penelope was there with a basket, gathering wildflowers from the bank. She didn't see him at first, and he could have slipped away unnoticed. He should have. Instead, he stood there, water dripping from his jaw, watching her hum softly to herself as she selected each bloom with care. "Oh," she startled when she finally saw him, nearly dropping her basket. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone else was here." "No need to apologize," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Public river." She smiled, and it was like watching someone light a lamp in a dark room. "I suppose that's true. I'm Penelope Sanders. My father and I moved here about 2 weeks ago. He's starting a carpentry business. Jackson Miller. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Miller." She tilted her head, studying him with an openness that made him uncomfortable. "You work at the mill, don't you? I've seen you walking past in the mornings." He nodded, unsure what else to say. The silence stretched between them, but she didn't seem bothered by it. Instead, she held up her basket of flowers. "My father thinks I'm being foolish, spending time picking these when there's real work to be done. But I think a home needs beautiful things, don't you? Even out here, especially out here, we need reminders that the world can be lovely." Jackson looked at the flowers, their petals bright against the woven basket. Once, he would have agreed with her. Once, he'd brought his wife flowers from the meadow near their home, and she'd put them in a jar on the kitchen table. His daughter had woven them into crowns and declared herself a princess. "I should get to work," he said abruptly, turning away. "Of course," Penelope said behind him, and if she was offended by his brusqueness, her voice didn't show it. "Perhaps I'll see you around town, Mr. Miller." He didn't answer, just walked away with his hands clenched at his sides and something uncomfortable pressing against his ribs. It felt almost like feeling, and he didn't want it. But Aztec was too small to avoid anyone for long, and Penelope seemed to be everywhere. She was at the general store when he came down for coffee. She was at the church helping to organize a social for the town. She was walking with her father past the mill, pointing out buildings and asking questions about the town's history. And every time he saw her, she smiled and said hello, like his short responses and obvious desire to be left alone didn't discourage her in the slightest. "You could try being friendlier," Mrs. Chen said one evening when she caught him watching Penelope from his window as she walked home from the store. "That girl has a good heart. Her father, too. They've had a hard time of it." Jackson wanted to say he didn't care, but Mrs. Chen had been kind to him, so he just asked, "What kind of hard time?" "Lost her mother and baby brother to fever 2 years back, down in Texas where they were living. Her father decided they needed a fresh start somewhere new. She takes care of him now, keeps house, helps with his business accounts. 22 years old and already seen enough grief for a lifetime." Mrs. Chen gave him a meaningful look. "Some people let loss make them bitter, others let it make them kind. She chose kind." After Mrs. Chen left, Jackson sat in the darkness of his room and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Shame. What right did he have to his carefully maintained numbness when this young woman, who'd suffered her own losses, still found reasons to smile? Still picked wildflowers and believed homes needed beautiful things. He didn't have an answer, but the question itself was a crack in the wall he'd built. The next Sunday, he went to the church social. He told himself it was because Mrs. Chen had made it clear she expected him to help set up tables, but that was only partly true. He found himself looking for Penelope in the crowd, and when he spotted her arranging food on one of the long tables, something in his chest tightened. She was laughing with another woman, her whole face lit up with joy, and Jackson realized he wanted to know what it felt like to be the cause of that laughter. The thought terrified him. "Mr. Miller," Penelope spotted him and waved him over. "I'm so glad you came. Have you met Sarah? She runs the boarding house on 2nd Street. Jackson nodded at Sarah, who gave him a curious look before excusing herself. Penelope turned back to him, still smiling. "Are you hungry? We have more food than this town could eat in a week." "I'm fine," he said, then forced himself to add, "Thank you. You're welcome." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You know, Mr. Miller, you look like a man who could use a friend. I don't mean to be forward, but I recognize that look in your eyes. I've seen it in my own mirror." The words hit him harder than any physical blow could have. He opened his mouth, closed it, unsure how to respond. Penelope didn't push, just stood there with patient understanding on her face. "I'm not very good company," he finally managed. "Neither am I most days," she said softly. "But I've found that two people who aren't very good company can sometimes be better together than they are alone." Before he could respond, her father called her name, needing help with something. She touched Jackson's arm briefly, a gesture so casual and yet so intimate that he felt it like electricity through his entire body. And then she was gone, moving through the crowd with that same easy grace. Jackson stood there, his arm burning where she'd touched him, and realized with growing panic that he was feeling something. Not the faint echo of emotion, not a distant memory of what feeling used to be like, but actual, present, overwhelming feeling. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. The world suddenly seemed sharper, more real, the colors brighter and the sounds louder and everything too much. He should have left. He should have gone back to his room and reinforced those walls and pushed everything back down into the numbness where it was safe. Instead, he stayed. He helped set up tables. He ate a plate of food that actually tasted like something. And when Penelope caught his eye from across the yard and smiled, he found himself smiling back, small and uncertain but real. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. It started with simple exchanges, conversations about the weather or the town, nothing deep or meaningful. But gradually, as spring turned toward summer, those conversations grew longer. Penelope would find him at the river in the mornings, and they'd talk while the sun rose over the mesas. She told him about growing up in Texas, about her mother's love of singing, about how her baby brother had barely lived long enough to be named. "Thomas," she said softly one morning, her fingers trailing in the water. "We called him Tommy. He was only 3 months old when the fever took him. Mama went 2 days later. I think she died of a broken heart as much as the sickness." "I'm sorry," Jackson said and meant it. "Thank you." She looked at him, her eyes clear despite the sadness in them. "It's strange, isn't it? How life just keeps going even when you think it should stop. The sun keeps rising. People keep needing things. You have to keep moving forward even when all you want to do is go back." Jackson swallowed hard. "My wife and daughter were killed by raiders 3 years ago. We were traveling to Santa Fe and they came out of nowhere. I was getting water from a creek when I heard the shots. By the time I got back, it was over." The words came out flat, factual, but saying them out loud for the first time in 3 years felt like tearing open a wound. Penelope didn't gasp or offer empty platitudes. She just reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his, and held on. "What were their names?" she asked gently. "Mary, my wife. She loved to read, always had a book in her hand. And Emily, my daughter, she was 5. She was learning to ride a horse." His voice cracked. "I buried them and then I just stopped feeling anything. It was easier." "I know," Penelope said, squeezing his hand. "Believe me, I know. After Mama and Tommy, I wanted to disappear into nothing. But Papa needed me and there was work to be done, and somewhere along the way I realized that feeling the pain meant I could also feel other things. Joy, hope, love. I didn't want to give those up, even if it meant hurting too." Jackson looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit perfectly between his. "I don't know if I remember how to feel those things." "Then maybe I can remind you," she said, and the hope in her voice was almost enough to undo him completely. From that day forward, they were inseparable. Jackson started helping Penelope's father with carpentry projects after his shifts at the mill, and discovered he enjoyed working with wood, creating things instead of just cutting them apart. Penelope would bring them lunch, staying to talk and laugh at her father's stories about his younger days. Thomas Sanders, Penelope's father, was a good man who'd been weathered by life but not broken by it. He saw the way Jackson looked at his daughter and pulled him aside one evening. "I know a haunted man when I see one," Thomas said, not unkindly. "I was one myself after we lost my wife and boy. But I also know a man trying to come back from that darkness, and that's what I see in you too." Jackson didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "My Penelope, she's got her mother's heart, big enough to hold a lot of love, brave enough to risk it even after loss. If you're going to be around her, I need to know you're not going to hurt her." "I would never," Jackson said fiercely, surprised by the intensity of his own emotion. "I care about her too much." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's what I thought. Good. She deserves someone who sees how special she is." As summer blazed across New Mexico, Jackson felt himself thawing like frozen ground. Penelope made him laugh, something he'd thought impossible. She challenged him, asked him questions about what he thought and felt and wanted. She taught him to see beauty again, pointing out the way light hit the river at sunset, the pattern of stars overhead, the resilience of wildflowers growing in harsh soil. One evening in July, they sat by the river as the sky turned gold and pink and purple. Penelope had been quiet, which was unusual for her, and Jackson had learned to recognize when she was working up to saying something important. "What are you thinking about?" he finally asked. She turned to him, and there was vulnerability in her eyes that he'd never seen before. "I'm thinking about how scared I am." "Of what?" "Of this. Of you. Of how much I've come to care about you in such a short time." She took a breath. "I told myself after Mama and Tommy that I wouldn't let myself love anyone too much, because losing them hurt too badly. But then you walked into my life, all closed off and determined not to feel anything, and somehow that made me want to reach you. And now I have. And you're letting yourself feel again, and I'm terrified because I'm falling in love with you, Jackson, and I don't know if you're ready for that." Jackson's heart was thundering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to protect himself, to retreat back into the safety of numbness. But when he looked at Penelope, at the courage it took for her to be so honest, he knew he couldn't do that to her. He couldn't do it to himself. "I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice rough. "I'm terrified. Because I'm falling in love with you too, and I swore I'd never let myself feel this way about anyone again. It's been easier to be numb, Penelope, so much easier. But you make me feel everything, and I don't want to stop. I don't want to go back to that emptiness." "Then don't," she whispered. "Stay here with me. Feel everything with me. The good and the bad and all of it together." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was remembering how to do this. But then she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that made his entire body come alive. He felt everything, the softness of her lips, the warmth of her skin, the way his heart raced, the absolute rightness of this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Penelope smiled against his lips. "See, not so scary after all." He laughed, actually laughed, and pulled her close, tucking her head under his chin. "Terrifying," he corrected, but he was smiling too. They courted properly after that, despite already knowing they were meant for each other. Jackson met Penelope every evening after work, walking her home from whatever errands she'd been running. They attended church together, sat next to each other at town gatherings, and scandalized some of the older ladies by going on unchaperoned rides out into the countryside. "Let them talk," Penelope said when Jackson mentioned it. "We're adults, and we've both lived through enough to know what we want." What they wanted was each other, and everyone in Aztec could see it. Jackson, who'd been a ghost of a man just months ago, was laughing and talking and participating in town life. He'd started building furniture with Thomas, beautiful pieces that people came from surrounding areas to purchase. He'd moved out of his room above the general store and into a small house on the edge of town, and Penelope helped him make it into a home, filling it with curtains and wildflowers and warmth. In September, as the heat began to break and the cottonwoods along the river turned gold, Jackson asked Thomas for permission to marry his daughter. They were in the workshop, the smell of sawdust thick in the air, and Jackson's hands were shaking. "I love her, sir. I know I'm not perfect, and I know I've got ghosts I'm still dealing with, but she makes me want to be better. She makes me want to feel alive and build a future. I'd spend the rest of my life making her happy if she'll have me." Thomas, who'd been sanding a table leg, set down his tools and looked at Jackson with eyes that were suspiciously bright. "Son, I gave you my blessing months ago when I saw the way you looked at her. Like she hung the moon and stars. That's how I looked at my wife, God rest her. You have my permission and my gratitude for loving my daughter the way she deserves." Jackson proposed that evening, taking Penelope back to the spot by the river where they'd had so many conversations. The ring had belonged to his mother, the one thing of value he'd kept through all his wandering, and it fit Penelope's finger perfectly. "Yes," she said before he could even finish asking the question, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in October, when the air was cool and crisp, and the sky was impossibly blue. The whole town turned out for the wedding, crammed into the small church that Jackson had helped repair all those months ago. Penelope wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and carried wildflowers from the river. Jackson wore a new suit that Thomas had insisted on buying him, and when Penelope walked down the aisle on her father's arm, he felt his throat close with emotion. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was his. This incredible woman who'd refused to let him hide in numbness, who'd pulled him back into the world of feeling and living, had chosen him. He still carried his grief. The memories of Mary and Emily were still there, but Penelope had shown him that having lost before didn't mean he couldn't love again. That opening his heart, despite the risk, was worth it. "I love you," he whispered when she reached his side. "I love you too," she whispered back, her eyes shining. The ceremony was simple but perfect. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Penelope with all the feeling he'd thought he'd lost forever, and the church erupted in cheers. The celebration lasted well into the night. There was food and music and dancing, and Jackson danced with his bride until his feet hurt and his face ached from smiling. Thomas gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying at once, talking about loss and love and second chances. "To my daughter and my new son," Thomas said, raising his glass. "May they find all the happiness they've earned." Jackson and Penelope spent their first night as husband and wife in the house Jackson had prepared, and he marveled at how different it felt to hold someone with his entire heart engaged instead of locked away. Every touch meant something. Every kiss was real. He could feel it all, the love and desire and joy and even the fear of losing this, and he wouldn't have traded it for anything. "What are you thinking?" Penelope asked, curled against his chest in the darkness. "That I'm glad you didn't give up on me," he said honestly. "That I'm glad you made me feel again, even when I didn't want to. You saved me, Penelope. She propped herself up to look at him, her hand on his cheek. We saved each other. I was so focused on being strong for Papa, on pushing through my grief without dealing with it, that I'd forgotten how to be vulnerable. You taught me that it's okay to still be broken in places. That love doesn't require perfection. He pulled her back down, holding her close. I don't know what the future holds, he admitted. Sometimes I'm still scared. Me too, she said. But we'll be scared together and happy together and alive together. That's all that matters. Their first year of marriage was everything Jackson had forgotten life could be. He and Thomas expanded the carpentry business, taking on larger projects and gaining a reputation for quality work. Penelope kept their home, but she also helped with the business accounts and started teaching reading to some of the town's children. They built a life together that was full and meaningful and real. There were hard days, of course. Days when Jackson woke from nightmares about losing Penelope the way he'd lost Mary and Emily. Days when Penelope missed her mother so intensely it hurt to breathe. But they faced those days together, holding each other through the pain, and gradually Jackson learned that feeling the bad didn't diminish the good. If anything, it made the good more precious. In the spring of 1884, Penelope told him she was pregnant. Jackson's first emotion was pure terror. What if something happened to her? What if he lost this baby the way he'd lost Emily? But Penelope took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. I know you're scared, she said. I'm scared too, but I want this, Jackson. I want our baby. I want a family with you. And I need you to be here with me, not hiding in fear of what might happen. He took a shaky breath and nodded. I'm here. I promise I'm here. And he was. Throughout her pregnancy, as her belly grew and the baby's kicks became visible from the outside, Jackson was present in every moment. He talked to the baby, told stories, sang songs he'd forgotten he knew. He built a cradle in the workshop, carving it with delicate patterns of wildflowers and rivers and mesas. Thomas helped, his own excitement at becoming a grandfather bringing new life to his weathered face. On a cold November night, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and Jackson paced the hallway outside their bedroom while the midwife worked. Every cry from Penelope felt like a knife in his chest, and he prayed harder than he'd prayed in years, bargaining with God for her safety. Finally, just before dawn, he heard the sharp wail of a newborn, and the midwife opened the door. You can come in now, Mr. Miller. Your wife and son are doing fine. Jackson's legs almost gave out with relief. He stumbled into the room and found Penelope propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she looked up at him, tears were streaming down her face. Jackson, come meet your son. He crossed to the bed on unsteady legs and looked down at the baby in her arms. He was tiny and red-faced, his little fists waving in the air, and Jackson fell in love instantly. Not the cautious, careful love he'd been afraid of, but immediate and complete and overwhelming. He's perfect, Jackson whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Can I hold him? Penelope transferred the baby into his arms, and Jackson cradled his son against his chest, marveling at how small he was. The baby opened his eyes, unfocused but searching, and Jackson felt something in his chest expand until he thought he might burst with it. Hello, little one, he said softly. I'm your papa. I've been waiting to meet you. What should we name him? Penelope asked, her hand on Jackson's arm. They'd discussed names for months but never settled on one. Now, looking at his son's face, Jackson knew exactly what felt right. James, he said. After your father's father, James Thomas Miller. Penelope's eyes filled with fresh tears. Papa will be so honored. James Thomas Miller. It's perfect. Thomas came to visit later that day, and the sight of the old man holding his grandson with such careful tenderness made Jackson's throat tight. This was family. This was what mattered, not just blood, but love and choice and the decision to keep feeling even when it was scary. The next few years passed in a blur of joy and exhaustion and profound gratitude. James grew from a tiny newborn into a sturdy toddler with his mother's eyes and his father's serious expression. Jackson taught him to walk, chasing him around the house while Penelope laughed. He taught him words, patient with each garbled attempt. He carved him toys and read him stories and tucked him in at night with a heart so full it sometimes hurt. In 1886, Penelope became pregnant again, and this time Jackson's fear was tempered by experience. He knew she was strong. He trusted the process. And when their daughter was born on a warm May evening, arriving faster than James had and announcing her presence with lusty cries, Jackson held her and felt complete. They named her Rose Mary Miller, honoring both Penelope's love of wildflowers and Jackson's first wife. It had been Penelope's idea, and when Jackson had protested, not wanting to hurt her, she'd taken his face in her hands. "Mary will always be part of your story," she said firmly. "And Emily too. They shaped who you are, and I love who you are. Let's honor them by giving our daughter a name that means something." So Rose it was, and she was perfect. Dark hair like her father, a sunny disposition like her mother, and a smile that could light up a room. James, now a protective 2-year-old, took his role as big brother seriously, always wanting to help with the baby. Thomas, now in his 60s but still working in the carpentry shop, was a devoted grandfather. He built toys for the children, told them stories, and gave Jackson advice on parenting that always proved invaluable. The 5 of them, sometimes 6 when Mrs. Chen came for dinner, were a family bound not just by blood but by love and choice and shared experience. One evening in the summer of 1887, after the children were asleep and Penelope was reading by lamplight, Jackson stood at the window of their home and looked out at the darkening sky. The mesas in the distance were shadowed against stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. 4 years ago he'd looked at this same view and felt nothing. Now he felt everything. "You're being contemplative," Penelope said, coming to stand beside him and slipping her arm around his waist. He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Just thinking about how different my life is now. How different I am. Better different, infinitely better." He turned to face her, his hands on her shoulders. "You know, when I first came to Aztec, I thought I was done. I thought the best I could hope for was to exist without pain. But you showed me that wasn't living." "You did the hard work yourself," Penelope said. "I just reminded you that you could." "You made me feel," Jackson corrected. "After years of numbness, you made me feel, and I didn't want to stop feeling. I still don't. Even on the hard days, even when I'm scared or sad or overwhelmed, I don't want to go back to that emptiness. Because feeling everything means I get to feel this too." He gestured around them at the home they'd built, the life they'd created. "I get to feel how much I love you. How grateful I am for our children. How lucky I am to have a second chance." Penelope's eyes were bright with tears. "I love you, Jackson Miller. Thank you for taking the risk. Thank you for opening your heart again. Thank you for not giving up on me," he said, and kissed her the way he'd kissed her by the river all those years ago, full of feeling and promise and hope. Life continued to unfold in Aztec, New Mexico. The town grew slowly, the carpentry business thrived, and the Miller family became a cornerstone of the community. Jackson never forgot Mary and Emily, keeping their memory alive in his heart, but he'd learned that grief and joy could coexist. That loving again wasn't a betrayal, but an honor to those he'd lost. James started school and showed an aptitude for reading that thrilled his mother. Rose grew into a spirited little girl who collected wildflowers just like Penelope had, filling the house with blooms in various stages of wilting. Thomas, though slowing down, remained active in the business and the children's lives, a beloved presence who told terrible jokes and gave the best hugs. In 1889, Penelope became pregnant a third time, surprising them both. She was 28 now, Jackson 33, and they'd thought their family was complete. But life had a way of bringing unexpected blessings. Their second daughter, Grace Elizabeth Miller, was born on a snowy December morning, small and perfect and immediately adored by her older siblings. James, now 5, declared himself her protector. Rose, 3, wanted to hold her constantly. And Jackson, holding his newest daughter while his family gathered around, felt his heart expand once more to accommodate this new love. 3 children, Penelope said wonderingly, watching Jackson with Grace. Can you believe it? No, Jackson admitted. 5 years ago, I couldn't imagine ever being happy again. Now I can't imagine being happier than this. Thomas, holding Rose on his lap while James leaned against his chair, smiled. This is what life's about, these moments right here, family and love and holding on to what matters. It was a philosophy Jackson had learned to embrace. He threw himself into fatherhood with an intensity that sometimes surprised him. He taught James to ride and to work with wood. He let Rose help in the garden, patient with her enthusiasm even when she pulled up as many vegetables as weeds. He walked Grace to sleep in the evenings, singing the same songs he'd once sung to Emily, finding that the memories no longer hurt quite as sharply. The years rolled forward, each one bringing new challenges and joys. James showed an interest in carpentry like his father and grandfather, spending hours in the workshop learning to measure and cut and sand. Rose discovered a love of storytelling, making up elaborate tales that she'd perform for anyone who'd listen. Grace, as she grew, proved to be the most adventurous of the 3, always climbing things she shouldn't and exploring places that made her parents nervous. In 1892, Thomas Sanders passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67. The loss hit the family hard. Penelope mourned the father who'd been her rock through so much hardship. The children cried for the grandfather who'd been such a presence in their lives. And Jackson grieved the man who'd welcomed him into the family and taught him so much about being both a craftsman and a father. They buried Thomas in the small cemetery on the edge of town, under a cottonwood tree not unlike the one where Jackson had buried Mary and Emily. At the funeral, Jackson held Penelope while she wept, and he marveled at how far he'd come. Once, he'd shut down in the face of grief. Now he could feel it fully and still function, could cry and still be strong, could hurt and still hope. He was so proud of you, Penelope said that night, lying in Jackson's arms. Of what you built, who you became. He told me once that you were the son he'd always wanted. Jackson's throat closed. He was the best man I've ever known. I hope I can be half the father to our children that he was to you. You already are, Penelope assured him. Every single day you are. The carpentry business became Jackson's sole responsibility after Thomas's death, and he poured himself into it, honoring his father-in-law's legacy by maintaining the quality and integrity Thomas had insisted upon. James, now 8, helped after school, and Jackson treasured those hours working side by side with his son, teaching him the skills Thomas had taught him. The children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and dreams. James was steady and careful, good with his hands and patient with detail. Rose was creative and dramatic, always putting on shows and writing stories. Grace was bold and curious, the one most likely to come home with scraped knees and wild tales of adventure. Jackson loved them all fiercely, differently, completely. And through them, he learned that the heart's capacity for love was infinite. That opening himself to feeling again hadn't just let in love for Penelope, but had cracked him wide open to experience all the profound emotions that made life worth living. In 1895, James turned 11 and Rose 9, both of them growing so fast Jackson could hardly believe it. Grace, at 6, was starting school and already making her mark as the child who asked the most questions. The house was always full of noise and activity, so different from the silent emptiness of Jackson's room above the general store all those years ago. One evening, when Penelope was putting Grace to bed and the older children were doing homework, Jackson sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mesas. The colors were spectacular, oranges and pinks and purples painting the sky, and he felt the beauty of it deep in his bones. "Papa, look what I made," Rose said, coming out to join him. She held out a piece of paper covered in careful writing. "It's a story about a brave knight and a princess who saves herself." Jackson took the paper and read it, impressed by her imagination and the way she'd crafted the narrative. "This is wonderful, sweetheart. You have real talent," Rose beamed. "Do you think I could be a real writer someday?" "I think you can be anything you want to be," Jackson said, pulling her close. "As long as it makes you happy." James came out next, sitting on Jackson's other side. "I finished that chair leg you asked me to sand. Want to check it?" "I'll look at it in the morning," Jackson said, ruffling his son's hair. "Right now, I just want to sit here with you two and enjoy this sunset." They sat in comfortable silence, Rose leaning against one side and James against the other, and Jackson felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what Penelope had given him. Not just herself, not just their children, but the ability to feel moments like this. To be present and aware and grateful for the simple beauty of a sunset and his children's presence. When Penelope joined them, Grace in tow, she squeezed onto the porch step with the rest of them, and they all watched the sky until the last light faded and stars began to appear. "I love our family," Grace announced with the certainty only a 6-year-old could have. "We love you too, sweetheart," Penelope said, and Jackson echoed the sentiment, looking around at these 4 people who were his entire world. That night, after all the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Jackson and Penelope lay in bed talking softly. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't come to Aztec?" Penelope asked. Jackson considered the question. "Sometimes. I probably would have kept drifting, finding another town, another job that required nothing from me. I might have lived that way for years, maybe the rest of my life." "I'm glad you came here," Penelope said. "I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you didn't let me hide," Jackson replied. "You could have, could have written me off as a lost cause, but you kept showing up, kept pushing, kept believing I was worth the effort." "You were worth it," Penelope said firmly. "You are worth it. Every day you prove that choosing to feel, choosing to love, choosing to live fully is worth the risk." Jackson pulled her close, his hand stroking her hair. "I never thought I'd get a second chance at happiness, at family, at love. But here I am, with more than I ever dreamed of." "We both got second chances," Penelope reminded him. "That's what makes this so special. We know how precious it is." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, secure in the life they'd built and the love they'd chosen. The years continued to pass, bringing change and growth. By 1898, James was 14 and already taller than Jackson, showing signs of the man he'd become. He decided to pursue carpentry seriously, apprenticing officially with his father and showing real skill. Rose, at 12, had filled dozens of notebooks with stories and poems, her talent undeniable. And Grace, 9 now, was still the family's wild child, though she'd also developed a gift for drawing that amazed everyone. Jackson, at 42, looked in the mirror sometimes and marveled at the man he'd become. There were more lines around his eyes, more gray in his hair, but there was also life in his expression. Joy, love, all the things that had been missing for so long. Penelope, at 37, was even more beautiful to him than the day they'd met. She'd grown into her role as mother and wife and community member, respected and loved by everyone in Aztec. She still collected wildflowers, still believed in making homes beautiful, still had that incredible capacity for kindness that had first drawn him to her. One autumn evening, Jackson took Penelope back to the river where they'd had so many important conversations. The children were old enough now to be left alone for a few hours, and he wanted this time with just her. They sat on the bank, the water flowing past, the cottonwoods golden in the fading light. Jackson took her hand the same way she'd taken his all those years ago when he'd first told her about Mary and Emily. "I want to thank you," he said. "For what? For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For making me feel when I'd given up on feeling. For loving me even when I was broken. For giving me a family and a life and a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Jackson, you don't have to thank me for any of that. Loving you has been the greatest joy of my life. I know I still have hard days," he continued. "Days when the memories hurt or the fear creeps in, but they're fewer and farther between now. And even on those days, I have you and the children to remind me of all the good things worth feeling. We'll always be here," Penelope promised. "On the hard days and the easy ones, that's what family is." Jackson kissed her then, soft and deep, pouring 15 years of love and gratitude into it. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I spent 3 years being numb," he said quietly. "And I've spent 15 years feeling everything with you. There's no comparison. Even with the pain, even with the fear, I choose feeling every single time." "Good," Penelope said, smiling through her tears, "because I'm not letting you go numb again. You're stuck with me and all these feelings forever." "Forever sounds perfect," Jackson said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They stayed by the river until the stars came out, talking and laughing and simply being together. When they finally walked home, hand in hand, Jackson looked at the house that glowed with lamplight and heard the sounds of his children inside, and he felt a peace he'd never thought possible. This was his life now. Not the one he'd planned, not the one he'd thought was over, but the one he'd been given a second chance to build. And every day he chose to live it fully, to feel it completely, to love with his whole heart. Because Penelope had taught him that being numb wasn't safety, it was just another kind of death. And he'd already wasted too much time not living. Now he embraced every moment, every emotion, every precious day with the family he adored. As the years moved toward the new century, the Miller family thrived in Aztec, New Mexico. Jackson's carpentry business was successful enough to employ 2 additional craftsmen. James worked alongside his father full-time after finishing school, proving himself a master of the trade. Rose's stories began appearing in regional publications, bringing pride to the entire family. And Grace, after her wild childhood, settled into studying art seriously, her drawings and paintings decorating every wall of the house. In 1902, James fell in love with a schoolteacher named Margaret, and Jackson saw in his son's eyes the same wonder and devotion he'd felt for Penelope. The wedding was beautiful, held in the same church where Jackson and Penelope had married, and when Jackson gave his son away, he felt both joy and the sweet ache of time passing. The next year, Rose announced her engagement to a journalist from Santa Fe who appreciated her talent and ambition. Her wedding was full of laughter and poetry readings, exactly what suited her personality. And in 1905, Grace surprised everyone by falling for a young man who worked at the mill where Jackson had first worked when he came to Aztec. The symmetry of it wasn't lost on Jackson, and he welcomed his soon-to-be son-in-law with open arms. By 1906, Jackson and Penelope were grandparents 3 times over, with James and Margaret providing 2 babies in quick succession, and Rose pregnant with her first. The house that had once held just Jackson and Penelope now overflowed regularly with children and grandchildren, noise and chaos and overwhelming love. Jackson, at 50, was graying and weathered but stronger than he'd been in his numbness. Penelope, at 45, was still the light of his life, still picking wildflowers, still making their home beautiful, still teaching him new ways to feel and love and live. One evening, with the house finally quiet after a day of grandchildren visits, Jackson and Penelope sat on their porch watching yet another spectacular New Mexico sunset. They'd done this thousands of times over 23 years of marriage, and it never got old. "Do you remember the first time we talked by the river?" Penelope asked, her head on his shoulder. "Every detail," Jackson said. "You were picking wildflowers. You told me homes needed beautiful things. I thought you were talking nonsense," Penelope laughed. "And now I know you were talking about more than just flowers. You were talking about filling life with beauty and meaning and feeling. You were talking about really living instead of just existing." "You learned that lesson well," she said softly. "I had a good teacher." Jackson kissed the top of her head. "You know, I think about who I was when I rode into Aztec in 1883. That man was already dead, he just hadn't stopped moving yet. But you brought me back to life, Penelope. You made me feel again, and even though it was scary, even though I fought it, I'm so grateful. Because every good thing in my life since then has come from choosing to feel." "Every good thing in my life too," Penelope said. "We healed each other, Jackson. We gave each other permission to live again after loss." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky change colors, listening to the river in the distance, feeling the cool evening breeze. Jackson thought about Mary and Emily, sending them love wherever they were. He thought about Thomas, grateful for the father figure who'd accepted him. He thought about all the years ahead, whatever they might bring, and he wasn't afraid, because he had Penelope. He had his children and grandchildren. He had a life full of meaning and purpose and connection. And most importantly, he had the ability to feel it all, to be present for every moment, to love without holding back. The numbness was gone, replaced by a richness of emotion that made every day worth living. And Jackson Miller, once a dead man walking, was more alive than he'd ever been. He'd been numb to everything for years, but she'd made him feel, and he never wanted to stop feeling again. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Jackson and Penelope went inside their home, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, together in every sense of the word. And in the wild west town of Aztec, New Mexico, their love story continued, a testament to the power of choosing to feel, to love, to live fully despite the risks, because of the risks, for all the beautiful, painful, wonderful things that made life worth every precious, feeling moment.